I want to first thank you all for joining us tonight for the Seattle Architecture Foundation's webinar, Unreinforced Masonry, Connecting, Preparing, and Preserving. My name is Kim Owens, and I'm the program director for Seattle Architecture Foundation. During normal operations, we offer quarterly Design in-Depth lecture series, in addition to a whole host of different walking tours in and around Seattle. You can find more information on our website, seattlearchitecture.org. Seattle Architecture Foundation acknowledges that we are on the traditional unceded land of the Duwamish and other Coast Salish people, a people forced to relocate, but who have persevered. SAF views the history of Seattle to include from time immemorial to today, and is committed to exploring that through our programs. Seattle Architecture Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to connect people to the architecture, design, and history of Seattle. Design in Depth is a volunteer-driven public programming team at Seattle Architecture Foundation. And I'd like to thank our amazing volunteers who helped put this together. So we have Lauren, Molly, and Vanessa, and without them, we would not be able to bring this panel to you tonight. And I'd like to thank our Design in-Depth sponsors. If you could forward the next slide, please. At the diamond level, we have LMN Architects. Our platinum level, we have Bassetti Architects, GLY, and Schuchart. And at our gold sponsor level, we have MacDonald Miller Facility Solutions. And last but not least, our grant maker for culture. We truly appreciate the support from these sponsors who make tonight's program possible. It's because of their generosity we can offer this program free of charge. Next slide. Tonight's program is in partnership with AIA Seattle and is inspired by the exhibit When Seattle Shakes. Researched and curated by Mary Waelder, this exhibit explores how to align the goals of historic preservation and resilient design by understanding the most effective ways of protecting historic buildings against earthquakes. This online exhibit is available to explore at whenseattleshakes.com. And I want to thank Mary, who is also serving as our moderator tonight, for sharing her research with us and participating. She has so much to share with you, and I just can't wait. But before I hand it over to Mary, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. Our closed captioning system is activated. You can see it at the bottom of your screen, CC. To control it, just simply click on that and you can activate it or you can turn it off. Please feel free to direct any questions you have during the presentation to the Q&A function on Zoom. You'll see it at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Our panelists love questions and we look forward to hearing from you, so please don't be shy. There will be time at the end of the presentation to address them. We are recording this presentation and it will be available on our YouTube channel and on the Seattle channel. For those of you who have registered, keep an eye out for an email from me letting you know when that Zoom or that YouTube link is up and ready for viewing. And with that, that is all I have. And I say, take it away, Mary.
Hi, everyone. I am Mary Waelder. Let me just make sure I have control of the screen so I can advance through the slides. Just to introduce myself before going through my intro slides, I am an architect here in Seattle. I work at SHKS Architects. We specialize in historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and community-oriented projects. And more recently, I've also been working with AIA Seattle on this online exhibit, When Seattle Shakes, which Kim has already introduced. So the intro slides I'm going to go through are basically a snapshot of what you can find online at that exhibit. The impetus for this exhibit was the risk posed to Seattle's historic buildings, not only from seismic events, but also from economic pressure. Our city is changing really fast, and we want to advocate for the retrofit of our historic buildings. hang on, just a bit of lag, getting ahead of myself. So Seattle is located in a really seismically active area. We're in the middle of the Seattle Fault Zone, which is the source of both shallow and deep earthquakes, such as the 2001 Nisqually quake 20 years ago. We're also located near the Cascadia subduction zone, which is where one tectonic plate slips underneath another. When people talk about the big one, they are talking about a subduction quake. So when we talk about seismic risks, they come on all scales, to small but still hazardous to really extreme. Within Seattle, we have a lot of historic buildings that have different risks. More specifically, we have over 1,000 unreinforced masonry buildings that have been cataloged by the city. And more than 2,000 low-income residents in Seattle live in unretrofitted brick buildings. I'm not going to get too deep into URMs because Lisa's going to talk about that more, but I will define URM for you here because it's going to be big throughout this whole discussion. A URM is a building with load-bearing masonry walls, typically brick, but it can be other forms of masonry that aren't braced by any reinforcing material. So it doesn't have a lot of flexibility. It can be very brittle. It can crumble or collapse. And this example image is of the Cadillac Hotel, which Eugenia is going to talk about more later on. When we think about the scale of the hazard and the problem in Seattle, we have to consider both the geologic factors, such as where are we going to experience liquefaction, which is loss of stability in the soil, which can be really dangerous to people and buildings. And where are we going to get floods from rising waters during an earthquake. And then understanding what does it mean when we have these hazards from the earth, and we also have these really vulnerable buildings placed on top of those areas. We can start to understand where the most dangerous areas are by where those factors intersect. And so looking at that scary map, you might be like, wow, this is a really big problem. Why don't we just demolish all of our older buildings and put up new ones with more advanced engineering? And there's a lot of reasons why we should still prioritize retrofitting and historic preservation. First of all, environmentally, it is better for the earth to retrofit an older building rather than extracting raw material and all of the embodied carbon that comes with that. So the more we can save, the more material we're preserving for sustainability as well as architecturally. The cultural impact. So we have our historic buildings which really shape the experience of our neighborhoods and shape the way people experience Seattle. And maintaining that history is important to the city. And finally, socially, a lot of these older buildings are in neighborhoods with immigrant communities, small businesses, or marginalized communities that can't necessarily afford to be in the newest buildings. So supporting resources to those communities and supporting the retrofit of those buildings so they can continue to be used by the same communities and support those people is really important for the success of our city and everyone in it. So all of those topics are going to be coming up throughout today's discussion, and I'm really excited to introduce all of these panelists that we're going to be talking with. We're really lucky to have them. First of all, we have Lisa Nitze. Lisa is the Director of Investor and Community Affairs at Nitze-Stagen and Company. She leads work on ASAP, which is a cross-sector coalition that advocates for legislation to upgrade Seattle's seismically vulnerable masonry buildings. ASAP creates incentives to help owners finance upgrades. She's also involved in a project called Oz Navigator, which invests in opportunity zone real estate projects in the Puget Sound area for community revitalization. Next, we have Kate Weiland. Kate is an architect and an associate principal at BuildingWork. Kate's leadership has been vital in the execution of complex community-oriented projects at BuildingWork, such as the renovation of Town Hall Seattle. Kate regularly gives talks on design subjects such as library design and seismic retrofits, such as the one that's happening right now. And finally, we have Eugenia Wu. who is the Director of Preservation Services for Historic Seattle. She's held this role for 11 years, working at the intersection of architecture, history, cities, and communities. Her work includes advocacy, community outreach, policy, and technical assistance. She currently serves on several boards, including the Governor's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, For Culture, and Jokomomo, which is another preservation organization. And now I'm going to give up my remote control so that Lisa can go ahead with her intro slide.
Unmute. Thank you, Mary. I'm Lisa Nitze with Nitze-Stagen, and our firm is known for its redevelopment of the old Sears warehouse in Soto, now the Starbucks headquarters, and for its renovation of Union Station and of Merrill Place on First Avenue in Pioneer Square. And our firm's experience redeveloping and seismically upgrading historic buildings in Seattle made us acutely aware of how many such buildings are being allowed to fall into disrepair because their owners do not want to incur the cost or cannot incur the cost of seismic upgrades. And we all know that the next big quake is coming. In the 70s, Seattle passed mandatory seismic upgrade legislation on URMs, but it then revoked it a couple of years later due to the cost burden it put on URM building owners. We believe that it's imperative to upgrade Seattle's URMs before the next major earthquake hits, because when it does, they will collapse and cause death and destruction and displacement for all of those living and working in them. And so nearly 2 years ago, we formed something called ASAP, the Alliance for Safety, Affordability, and Preservation, to address this issue. So the current situation, and Mary touched on some of this, is that you've got between 1,000 and 1,100, the numbers are constantly changing, URM buildings that have been identified by the city. And cost to seismically upgrade them is a reason that is most often given for why people don't upgrade them. The URMs represent a very significant portion of the affordable housing stock, which is something that is extremely important at this point, and people are spending a lot of time on that. And residents and small business owners living and working in the URMs are often from underserved communities. Most of Seattle's neighborhoods have a terrific amount of their history and their character derived from their URMs. If not seismically upgraded, the previous slide and these slides are what happened to buildings, causing danger to neighborhoods and contributing to making the neighborhoods unsafe by attracting unsafe behavior, unsafe activities, and can be very dangerous and actually detrimental to neighborhoods. So this is a building that was damaged by the Nisqually quake and has tenants on the first floor, but has abandoned upper floors because they were damaged in the quake and have just been left that way. So what did we do about this issue? Again, we brought together nearly 120 stakeholders from all the different groups that care about this one way or another. Developers, URM building owners, historic preservationists, engineers, architects, neighborhood associations, the city and the county, and the city council. And we brought them together to work on this issue. This is our Merrill Place building that's pictured here. And that was seismically upgraded when redeveloped and withstood the earthquake unharmed. To address the cost of retrofitting URMs, we developed and proposed as ASAP a URM retrofit credit in order to help defer the costs for building owners. And this retrofit credit was based on the fact that developers value bonus density. And so it's designed around the fact that developers could purchase retrofit credits sold by URM building owners. And then the URM building owners would use those funds to defray the cost of their seismic upgrades. The bonus density could then be targeted in transit-oriented development areas. And that would leverage public dollars already spent. These 120 people spent a lot of time developing and updating and refining this proposal, and had a lot of input from the city and the county. The stakeholders then formed 4 groups to deal with the 4 buckets of challenges that came in all discussions with a mandatory seismic upgrade piece of legislation. The first was working group looked at, what happens to the people and the businesses that are in the building? Where do they go while the building's being retrofitted? The second group was looking at the fact that if we were going to be asking building owners to retrofit their buildings within a certain period of time, there would need to be streamlined regulatory review in the city and approval processes set up. The third was looking at, how much does it actually cost to do these retrofits, and how much would this credit program need to generate in order to enable the upgrades? And the fourth was looking at how we could, when people had their buildings opened up to be doing the seismic upgrades, how we could be incentivizing them to also do environmental upgrades at the same time. The group worked on this for about over a year and really got to the point where it had come to agreement with the city council, with the county, on the fact that moving forward on mandatory seismic upgrade legislation was something that we should do. And we got it right up to that point, and then COVID hit. So it's been frozen in time for a year with everybody focusing on COVID, but we're now ready to get back at it and see if we can get this legislation over the finish line. The next steps that need to happen are in the legislation that is crafted. Standards minimum URM upgrade standards need to be identified. The number of years within which building owners can need to upgrade their buildings needs to be identified. Financing mechanisms also need to be developed, including the retrofit credit. And the city council and the city need to develop a resolution requiring mandatory URM seismic upgrades. So www.upgradeasap.com is our website. We'd love to have you join us and work with us on this critical issue. And I'll turn it over now to Kate.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give up remote control. There you go.
I've got it. Hi, all. I am Kate Weiland. I am an architect at BuildingWork, a firm here in Seattle. Our areas of expertise at BuildingWork are in historic building renovation, as well as civic building design. And sometimes we get to work on projects that sort of bridge those two, which is a fantastic opportunity. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about BuildingWorks process and look at a couple projects that we're working on, past, present, and future, to explore different ways that seismic retrofits and addressing URM buildings are occurring in Seattle right now. So our approach to seismic retrofits is not the same on every project we come toward. We truly believe that there are no standard solutions. We want to study every building that comes to us in need of a seismic retrofit to learn what makes it unique. We really promote extensive collaboration between the architect and the structural engineers, and you'll see why as I get into some of the details on this project. We work with really creative structural engineers who are on the same page about making buildings really special and really functional. We determine the character defining features that should be lightly touched. Any modifications you make to an existing building will have an impact aesthetically. So how do you balance that old and new? How do you tell the story of the life of the building? We look for existing elements that can be augmented to improve the seismic performance of a building. And then we consider hybrid approaches. There are many different ways to approach seismic building design or seismic building retrofits. So what can we pull from each of these categories to make one comprehensive whole? And then finally, well, at heart, we're designers, right? We want to create a visual dialogue between the historic elements and the new structural elements. So I'm going to start with a project that'll be starting construction here in the next month or two. You may know this building, but you may know it a little more boarded up. This is the Metropole. It is right across the street from the Smith Tower, from the sinking ship parking garage in Pioneer Square. The project itself is actually two buildings. You'll see the Metropole, the stone building on the right, and the Busy Bee building on the left. That building actually did have two of its top floors come down during the 1949 earthquake. And as part of our design project, we will be rebuilding those with modern materials up to current building codes. The owner of the project is the Soderbergh Foundation. This foundation believes in strengthening our communities by promoting a just society and a sustainable environment. So the project program is really neat. It's going to be a low-cost office space and childcare that's subsidized by the foundation in order to accommodate not-for-profits that support communities of color. So wonderful program that's going into this building. The building itself is really unique because this stone building on the corner was originally intended to be a high-rise. They built the first 3 floors, and then the economy back in the turn of the century had a bit of a downturn, and nothing ever got built above. But what we were able to do with our structural engineers, Swenson Seyfajay, is look at the building, and this diagram on the right shows you the interior has these massive brick walls that were originally built to support all the floors that were going to go up above. And we're actually able to use those in our seismic retrofit. We're infilling them with some concrete, we're doing some treatments to the brick and mortar, and those are going to be the new shear elements for this building. They will be bolstered by a couple of moment frames in steel that you can see as well, and some other interventions across the floors and things like that. But this was a really great opportunity to use what the building already had to be more effective in our design of the retrofit. Next, I'll talk a little bit about Town Hall Seattle. Town Hall Seattle is an amazing not-for-profit organization that believes everyone deserves access to fresh ideas and artistic expression. So they were operating out of this fabulous church. It was an old Fourth Church of Christ Scientist, unreinforced masonry building, and an amazing top floor that had a long span truss system, a huge dome in the center, these gorgeous stained glass windows, all things that are not great in the event of an earthquake. So a typical approach to this building might be to come in and put big steel brace frames, but we didn't want to interrupt the gorgeous stained glass, the big openings in this building. So our structural engineer team worked with us to find a way to insert shear walls, concrete 1 foot thick rigid walls into the 4 corners of the building where stairwells existed. And then we were able to take a really light touch throughout the rest of the hall. You can see the upper right photo is from our design model of the building saying, okay, we still have to brace this unreinforced masonry. The walls are really tall. You have to have something that keeps it from swinging in or out in an earthquake. But how can we make this shape? How can we frame the stained glass that's there and really bring attention to it rather than crossing it or breaking it up? And so then the photo on the bottom, you'll see on opening night that it's pretty close. We were really happy with how this turned out, that we were able to just enhance the details that were in the building, really bring those into the forefront while adding life another 100 years to the use of the building. And then lastly, we'll talk about a project that is in its early design phases. This is in Pioneer Square as well, right off of Occidental Park. It's actually a half block of 8 individual buildings. Each of these buildings has a small enough footprint that it would be infeasible economically to strengthen them independently. That would be 8 sets of brace frames, 8 sets of drag struts, 8 sets of everything to make these buildings operate individually. So what we were able to do is work with the building ownership. They bought all 8 buildings on the half block, and we're addressing them as one seismic retrofit across the entire block. And so that way, from a structural engineering point of view, you have fewer steel members, fewer shear walls, tying those forces across the entire block in order to really take advantage of the scale of a large project where unreinforced masonry buildings are often quite small. And those are the ones that get ignored for longer and longer because there just aren't the funds in place in order to make that work. So our structural engineers there, CPL, are working with us to find the best way to, you can see from the diagrams, the structural strategy that we're using, the full block strategy, to really make it an economically feasible project to keep these buildings in Pioneer Square, keep them around for another 100 years in the character of that area. So Eugenia, I'll hand it off.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. And I'm honored to be here with Kate and Mary and Lisa this evening. I want to thank SAF for all the great work that they do. So I am the Director of Preservation Services at Historic Seattle, and our organization is kind of a hybrid organization. We're a nonprofit membership or preservation organization, and we're also a public development authority. So we're developers as well. So we've been around since 1963. We own 8 historic properties, and my focus is on advocacy. So I work a lot with the community and on trying to save places that matter. And so our 3 main program areas are education, advocacy, and preservation. And so oftentimes our projects kind of involve all 3. And some of the URM related ones that I'll be talking about involve all 3 actually. And so we talked a little bit about some that you heard earlier about this mandate or legislation that the city is considering for seismic retrofits of buildings to this sort of bolts plus standard. So there was a committee that the city created, and I served on that committee, and a previous technical committee that our executive director Kai Kelly served on. And essentially, it's recognizing how important seismic safety is and seismic upgrades, and how do we achieve that in these 1,000+ URM buildings, but how do we do it? How can property owners afford it? How can there be this mandate, but if the city doesn't provide the funding for it, you know, what happens? That's a big rub here. And so the legislation does not currently exist. It hasn't been passed. It hasn't even gone to city council. The mayor hasn't brought it to city council. This policy committee I served on started in 2012. So it's been going on for a while. But anyway, we can kind of get into some more policy later, but I just kind of want to show you some of the examples of projects that we've been involved in. And so you saw earlier images of the Cadillac Hotel. So this is in Pioneer Square, right at 2nd and Jackson, and right kind of in the core of the district. And we acquired the building after the earthquake, so we did not own it during the earthquake. And so you can see this great image of it in its heyday when it was built. The building was damaged, it was privately owned at the time. The owner wanted to tear it down, and so this became a big advocacy issue for us to try to save the building, to keep it from being torn down, and it's in the historic district. We got, I think, 3 structural engineers looked at it, different firms looked at it, and we realized that it could be shored up temporarily and rehabilitated. So we were able to successfully acquire the building and then go about doing the actual work of saving it and rehabbing it. And so it reopened in 2005. So essentially what you see, it looks like how it does now. And the National Park Service is up on the upper 2 floors, and the Klondike Gold Rush Museum is on the main floor and in the basement. And so here's an example of a project that started off as advocacy and turned into one of our preservation projects. And also it continues to contribute to the community, not only architecturally, but as a place, you know, to house offices and also, you know, a heritage associated use. And so people can come and learn about the Klondike Gold Rush Museum and about Pioneer Square. So, so buildings need to have a useful life, and we gave it that in this project. And another project, even though the, Washington Hall is not a URM building, it's a frame building, but it's clad in brick. Ultimately, it comes down to, so for free preservation is about community and place. And this really just evokes that. And we do this for people and the communities. And we try to do it, we want to do it without displacement. And so it was really important for this project in the central area to remain in the community and to basically continue the same uses it's always had. It was originally the Danish Brotherhood Hall Lodge, and but always open, multi-layered, multi-ethnic history, just really diverse history that just continues to today. And so a lot of times projects like this, you know, if you're doing substantial alteration, you have a lot of code upgrades, and you're going to be doing seismic upgrades anyway. So that's mandated already. The rub comes with when you just have a building, you know, it's been around for over 100 years. It's survived 3 earthquakes. It's still standing. You know, there might be some cracks or maybe a parapet kind of, you know, part of it fell down or something, but ultimately it's still there. And what would motivate a property owner to spend money to fix it up and not be able to, you know, monetize from it? They're not going to be able to raise rent to help pay for it. But it's all about the safety of it's about the public safety and about the safety of the occupants. And so that becomes the big sort of question here, is like, how can people afford this? Not all property owners are created equal. Some have the resources to do this work, others do not. And then you have a lot of people in between. And so that's just sort of just a kind of a quick overview of where we are. So we offer kind of a different perspective from more of a nonprofit and ownership perspective, and also a group that also connects with a lot of different communities in the city. And I think that's sort of what I have to say, and we'll be happy to take questions from Mary and also from all of you in the audience. Thank you.
But I think from me first, right? Okay. Well, thank you to our panelists for such a good introduction. We already have a really good amount of material for discussion and a really strong background from all of those presentations. One of the themes has been that right now, Seattle is not seismically prepared. So in your opinion, what would a seismically prepared Seattle look like? And if we could start with Eugenia, and then Kate, and then Lisa.
Great, thanks, Mary. Well, I think a seismically prepared Seattle would look like, it would have a mandate in place. That's a start. And Historic Seattle does support that. And it would be a program that's in place that the city has created with the help of property owners and community owners and community people, those impacted by what the legislation would bring. And having a way to do the upgrades and have a really clear direction, and that there's some sort of financial assistance available. And then obviously prepared Seattle would be these having less than 1,000 buildings, you know, having that number go down, right, in terms of having it being retrofitted, so we're not kind of focused on that. And then ultimately it would be it's ultimately about the safety of the people. And so there is no earthquake proof building, that doesn't exist. It's more what can we make that's earthquake resistant, and it's not if, it's going to be when will the big one hit.
I think that when we're talking about what is a seismically prepared Seattle, it's not just about what happens in the moment when the earthquake hits, but really what happens the next day. What people can go back to an office and do work, what individuals can go back and open up their restaurant and serve food to the people who are living in Seattle. And how do we as a city want to assure that all of our neighborhoods, all of our community members have equal access to the day after the earthquake, going back to life as normal. I think that all of us have realized in the past year that life as normal can look really different. And it looks really different if, say, you're a person working in the tech sector, or if you're a person who has to interact with humans on a day-to-day basis. And we have similar themes in the users of our buildings and the pockets and neighborhoods and types of businesses that live in different areas. Some of our highest concentrations of unreinforced masonry buildings are in the Chinatown International District. They're in Pioneer Square. They're in the University District. And so what happens if an entire neighborhood is gone overnight? What does that do to our communities? So to me, a prepared Seattle is one that has addressed the day after the big one. We can at least function. We can get around. We can have people be safe, even if the buildings need work or need next steps, and that it's not an entire breakdown of different areas.
I think a seismically prepared Seattle, what it would look like is that you would not have endangered affordable housing stock. You would not have endangered underserved areas in the city that would lose small businesses and residents as a result of the quake. You'd have safety. I mean, it's a really a social justice issue that most of these URMs have living and working in them, people in underserved communities. So you'd have safety for those people, and you'd have a more equitable city as a result of that. And then I think the other thing is that these buildings are defining elements of neighborhoods throughout the city, and we would lose an awful lot of our history and culture if we lost them. So, a prepared Seattle would be making sure that we don't lose those buildings, and that they are valued, and that the city takes the steps necessary to enable them to be upgraded.
Thanks for those responses, everyone. I think it's important to remember that the actions that we take or don't take now are going to determine whether we get to the Seattle that we want to have in the future. Yeah. And I want to build off what Lisa was saying about the way that these buildings contribute to neighborhoods. So the next question is, what are some examples of the values that URM retrofits can add to the city of Seattle? Or on the flip side, is there value lost by not retrofitting a URM? And what's an example of that? Beyond just the public safety angle, what are some of the outcomes of retrofitting a URM? And let's start with Kate, and then move on to Lisa, and then Eugenia.
Yeah, I think that intrinsically, we are connected to URM buildings, to buildings that are made of textural materials like brick, buildings of that scale. Most of the buildings we're talking about, URMs, are 3 to 4 stories, because that's about how tall you could go with brick before it didn't stand anymore. And so it's something about that feel of the city, that scale of the city, that nostalgia of the city that URMs really bring as one part of Seattle's story. There's many parts of Seattle's story, we could say, have been almost completely obliterated. And so at what point do we recognize that, and do we say, all right, but if we have a chance to stop it, now's the time, and how can we do that? I think that the value added by URMs and retrofitting those and saving those, it does come to a lot of the policy that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation of what's the tipping point. Yes, someone can come in and throw $30 million at an unreinforced masonry building to change it from artist lofts and the pickup store on the corner and anything else into this fabulous modern space that's going to rent for a whole lot of money and not house the same groups. But what's the middle ground? What can we do to make these buildings safer? What can we do to keep them in our communities and active for the people who have been living and working in them for years, and still do the improvements that are needed? And that's where the work of people like Eugenia and people like Lisa, who work with the policymakers on what are the highest risk elements in these buildings? How can we address just those? How can we not have to bring it all the way up to code? How do we bring it up to a place where it's safe for people to be in, if and when the event happens, that folks will be able to go back to their lives and their places that they're living and they're working, and that they can afford to live and work in the city of Seattle, to be quite honest. So, I mean, we're sort of at a tipping point here. We have two options of do something, even if it's not all the way, make these buildings safer. We'll talk a little bit about these different options, or wait until they fall down and build something new in their place, which I don't think any of us are advocates for.
Examples of value added to Seattle by a URM retrofit. I was most struck in all the work we were doing with community groups to figure out what are the challenges to this kind of legislation, and what are the solutions. I was very struck by the fact that displacement, if the building falls down and either kills the people in it or everyone has to leave because the building is destroyed, the displacement of the small businesses and the displacement of the people who have been living in affordable housing units is a really big deal. I mean, we spent a lot of time in Chinatown ID, and if your building's gone, it means you have to go somewhere else, and not necessarily can the neighborhood that you are currently in provide you with the housing or the place for your business. And then you're looking at moving away from family and friends. You're looking at a whole lot of cultural issues. And then you're looking at having to move back again. That's something that I think people don't necessarily think about, but it's a really big deal. So I think, an example of the value of having these buildings not be destroyed is that all of the activity in and around them and the people who live and work in them would not have their lives upended.
Yeah, I think some of the value added, I mean, you talk about, the city exists on an economic engine. You needed to keep running. And to do that, in a seismic event, you want not only the day after or the week after for things to kind of go back to normal, but as much as possible. But to limit the damage to the buildings is really important, just from an economic standpoint, and from these are people's homes in apartment buildings, and also these are people's businesses or offices or the retail storefronts. It's all connected and tied, and so not being able to rebuild or for a while would have a huge impact on a neighborhood or a community or the entire city. So I think the value added by doing the retrofit is really supports the ongoing economy of a place, and the value lost. Just from Kate touched upon this, is sort of these places tell a story of the city, and to not have them around anymore. Like, imagine if the Cadillac was gone, like what would have been in this place, and so it's not that easy. And look around in the world where big earthquakes have happened, and Christchurch and other places, and there are entire neighborhoods that are destroyed, and that's just a big change. So that's a huge value loss there. You can't rebuild something that was built 100 years ago or more.
So since the stakes are really high, not only on a public safety level, but a community level and an interpersonal level and a cultural level, I want to move us towards discussion of, on a practical level, what are some of your experiences of solutions to the URM problem, whether that's on a project scale with a design solution, whether it's a funding solution, a policy solution, or a broader strategy to address this issue. Just what are your experiences in solving the problem? And let's start with Lisa and then go to Kate and then Eugenia.
When we started this and said, why is it that people are letting these buildings fall down and they're not seismically upgrading them? And there is a quake coming, and what is going on here? It came down to, every time, it came down to the fact that it's expensive to do, and that many building owners can't afford it. And so that's why we spent as much time as we did really digging in on a whole proposed way to fund it, which was this retrofit credit program, which we spent a ton of time on, and actually we think will be very successful in raising, if not all of the funding necessary, certainly enough to defray the costs and make it possible. And so, I think that's the thing that we feel is kind of the go no go issue that has to be solved. And there is a very good proposal in place for how to do that.
Yeah, I think that Lisa hits the nail on the head there, that it's a cost issue. If you're not already planning to do a full renovation of your building, what is the impetus to do this? I mean, if you do a full renovation by code, you do have to bring the building up to just about modern seismic standards. Like, that's part of the deal. Anything else you do, if you want to change what the building's used for, if you want to extend the useful life by making it into something that makes a lot more money, those are the things that are built into the code. So then the question is, all right, voluntary seismic retrofits. That's what we call them, right? Nothing is making you do this. You're doing this because it's safer for your building occupants. Your building will hold up better in the event of an earthquake. What are the options for those? And so that's when we really do start to get a little more creative in our problem solving techniques. Maybe you phase the implementation of the thing. Maybe you say, okay, there's a retrofit strategy called Bolts Plus. From my extensive structural engineering expertise, I have all of my structural engineers on the participant list here. Bolting your floors to your walls was first introduced to the building code back in the 1920s as like, oh, if you have a brick building, you have to really attach the walls to the floors. That's an important thing to keep everything stable. And it's similar to the approach we take on retrofitting buildings that don't have that approach right now, right? We attach the walls to the floors. We brace the parapets because those are going to be the first to come down in an event. We interconnect different elements to each other to make the building act as one, rather than a bunch of individual things that shake independently and start to go down. So how can you phase that work? If you have $40,000 this year, and in a couple of years, you'll have $40,000 more. Do you do half the building now and half the building later? Do you, move tenants around the building so you're not displacing them and you're keeping your rent cycle up as work's occurring? These are all sort of things that we see ownership trying to do because they recognize that the tenants in their building are important and their safety is important. And as this topic gets more publicity and more press, and it's on the minds of more people, like everybody sitting here today, where you go to your landlords and say, is our building really not safe? Because we need to do something about that, or it's not gonna go well here. These are the opportunities that we have.
Yeah, I'll follow up with Kate on that, since she is our architect on the Good Shepherd Center, and our fabulous structural engineers who are also there, supposed to say Vache. So what we're, knowing that this mandate is supposed to come at some point, we decided let's not wait. Let's, we need to do the right thing. So it's become voluntary, and we want to kind of get ahead of it. And because the Good Shepherd Center in Wallingford houses dozens of nonprofits, there's a school, there's a senior center. I mean, there's a lot going on in that building with a lot of people, and then all the people who come for classes and meetings and all that kind of stuff. But we don't have $5, $6, $7, however $million it's going to cost to do this lying around. We're accessing grant funds, which we're able to access because we're nonprofit. And I realize that private property owners don't have access to funds like that usually, which is unfortunate. So there are solutions there, but it's not cheap, as Kate and Lisa have said. And there's no magical solution there. I mean, there aren't any in California. They're way ahead of us only because they have more seismic events, more serious ones, and it's mandated. And they move beyond URMs. They're like they look at other masonry building types. And so there's definitely design solutions. We know. It's what's hard is there's not funding solutions and the policy ones that's where the hand wringing comes, and the inertia and the politics, and politics should not come into it. And this will probably kind of segue into like a future question. But yeah, so.
Eugenia, thank you for setting that up so well for me about the inertia, because the next question is, given how long Seattle has taken to pass policy, still not succeeded in passing policy, how long we've been aware of this issue, what is it going to take to actually move a citywide URM solution forward? And if you could start off with the answer to this question, and then we'll go to Lisa, and then we'll finish up with Kate.
Well, I guess the cynical response is another seismic event. I mean, 2001 was the last big earthquake, Nisqually. So I don't know how many of you watching experienced that, but the viaduct has since come down, but that was a big thing for the longest time, because if nothing is done with it, then it's going to pancake and collapse, and all these people are going to die in their vehicles. And so there's always this sort of we know it's going to come. But then nothing really gets done. There's a lot of talking and a lot of studies and a lot of analysis that happens, and it's not a popular political decision for city council or any mayor, because there's just going to be a lot of people who are going to say, how can you do this? How can you mandate it? And we just can't afford it. And so it becomes a sort of circular sort of thing. But that's sort of my what I've been experiencing, unfortunately. But the city just needs to rip the Band-Aid and just do it.
The Seattle City Council has a committee, the Safety and Human Services Committee, that Councilmember Herbold chairs, and that's the City Council committee that will take up this legislation as it is revived, and she's been a very big proponent of this. And we've worked very closely with Nathan Torgelson and all sorts of people in the mayor's office. He runs SDCI, which has a lot to do with these issues. And there's huge support there. So I think it's a matter of having a strong public-private partnership of all of the stakeholders involved, so that everyone agrees on what is being advocated for, and that one has worked through and taken seriously and listened carefully to concerns that people have and figured out answers to them or solutions. that everybody can live with. You know, I think that's how to get it done. Again, we are at a moment where the city's kind of waking up and coming out of the COVID period that has been all consuming. So I think the time is now.
Yeah, and I think that the way to move a citywide URM policy forward is to consider the entire city in that policy. And the work that Lisa and her group is doing with raising an awareness of things like transfer of development rights. A lot of unreinforced masonry buildings are landmarks, which means you can't add 20 stories to them, even if they're in downtown Seattle. They are protected. They do need to stay about the size they are, but they're on a plot of land that in theory, if the building fell down, you could build however many hundreds of feet up in the air. So in the past on projects, we've had individual projects try and take advantage of that. So Town Hall Seattle sold some of their air rights and their development rights to the building right next door, which are these 30 some odd story residential towers. And they could do that because the city policy allowed that transfer on the same city block and in the same region. But in areas like Pioneer Square, you can't sell additional height to the guy down the block because he also can't build 10 stories on top of his building. The entire district's protected. So these ideas of saying, okay, we're bigger than individual buildings and even individual neighborhoods. How can we get some of the developer money that exists over here into Pioneer Square to reinforce the buildings, into the International District to reinforce those buildings? Well, it's by giving the incentive in the areas where it matters and where it's possible and where developers have money to spend and they're going to spend it anyway. So I do think that all of this work that Lisa's talking about and that Eugenia was brought up in the earlier discussions with the city is incredibly important to move this process forward as a city.
Yeah.
Kate, what you just described also just came up in the Q&A from an audience question saying, I imagine that the current land value supersedes the value of retrofitting the existing structure. And unless the city assists financially, more buildings will fall down to bank on their ruins. And yeah, I mean, it all comes down to money, which is the unfortunate truth and which sort of is at odds with what we're trying to achieve in terms of community connections and historic preservation. So I'm trying to formulate a question out of that to move on from.
I think to be fair, there's both. Not every unreinforced masonry building in the city is owned by someone who's hoping it'll fall down and then they can sell their property to somebody who can build and they'll make a lot of money. I think a lot of times in the International District, buildings are owned by families. And so it's a larger group of people that needs to come together and make the decision or move the things forward like that, which can be a challenge. I mean, I think that in some cases, say the University of Washington, they have a huge amount of unreinforced masonry buildings that they need to cycle through and get fixed. And then in some cases, it's families that have, or individuals who have held on to the buildings for years and years and have just sort of let them live their life. But now is the time that they need to bring those up to code. And so having a path, having a route is important. You can use the carrot, you can use the stick. We'll probably have to use a little bit of both in order to get everybody to comply, but both options should be there.
Lisa or Eugenia, do you want to jump in on what the city of Seattle can do about people trying to get the value out of their land for more development if their building collapses, rather than doing the work to maintain the buildings that they have that have historic value?
That is something that we have seen, and it is, you know, some of the people whose buildings are starting to crumble are doing that, and others would like to fix them up and can't afford to. So it's there, and it's part of the mix.
Yeah, when I was on the URM policy committee, I mean, I think at the first meeting I was in, I brought up the unintended consequences of the policy, the mandate, and said, okay, because they're going to be, if people are forced to upgrade, then if they can't afford it and they're not developers, they don't know how to, do a project. One of their options would be, well, then I'll just sell it to someone, and it's not my problem anymore, or I'll demolish it, right? So having a mandate like this, which is the city clearly said, this is we value historic buildings, and we want this to be a good thing for historic buildings to extend the life of these buildings, but sometimes it could have the opposite effect, right? As I just mentioned. But then at the same time, with the development pressure in Seattle, the natural development pressure that's been going on, we have a lot of demolition anyway. So, and it has nothing to do with it being a URM or being caused by, having an owner having to retrofit the building. So that's sort of an interesting thing to bring up there. It's like these same buildings could, as we talk now, if someone's looking at this parcel of land in a neighborhood and how high can they build or what can they build there, and unless these are eligible to be landmarks or are landmarked or in a historic district, they don't have any protection. So that's sort of kind of the state of things as they exist now.
I'm going to go slightly off script and go off of that a bit, because that thing is happening in my neighborhood down the street from me right now. We have these historic brick churches. One of them, what you're describing, like they couldn't upgrade their building, they couldn't maintain the rent on the building, they couldn't do any of the things needed to be able to financially support it. And so they sold the building, and even though a mandate has not even yet occurred, it just was torn down and made into a hole in the ground, and is only just now a year later being developed. And so there's another URM church in my neighborhood that has also just been sold and displaced a lot of community benefits that previously were there. And so as I'm seeing this happen and I'm aware of it, I'm wondering, like, what can someone in the neighborhood like myself, someone like the audience members who are viewing this right now, what can we do to advocate for buildings in our neighborhoods and our communities that don't have the financial resources to do what's necessary to maintain their buildings? Is there something we can do, or does it then fall back to policy? And I guess, Eugenia, if you have an answer to that, and then we'll go back to Kate and Lisa.
Sure. Are you talking about the university district, perhaps?
Yes.
Your examples. Yeah,
yes, I live in the
it's
district.
It's depressing. And just as an aside, but it's kind of a huge issue in Seattle. Landmarking. So religious properties are exempt from landmarking, whereas for other properties, owner consent is actually not required for landmarking. So that's not a tool for protection that's available. Yeah, I think it's, the city responds to people who write to them and call them. It's pretty easy to send an email, and if you care about these places in your neighborhoods, it could be a 1 or 2 story commercial vernacular brick building, but it's just really a place that's meaningful because of it provides affordable spaces, for businesses, and to see that gone and displace what's there would be, not a good thing. And so I do know that the city responds to community voices, and the more they hear, then they're like, oh wow, this is really important. We know, they know the URM issue is very important. They do know that, and I think they want to truly do something. And so if they hear people saying, we hear the things we would like to see, and they see that support, so it's easy for them to vote on these things, and they could say, look, all these people support it. And we know it's not going to be easy. We know it's going to be difficult and expensive, but work with us. And so if they hear that, rather than just the few property owners who own URMs who are, not that supportive, and if they're only hearing sort of more negative things, and then they don't know who else out there is voicing it. So, and it needs to go beyond the design and preservation communities as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Eugenia was saying about how the voices of many in support can outweigh the voices of a very, very vocal few who it may directly affect to have to take on these mandates and things like that. And so agreed, staying abreast of what's going on. Folks who are here today obviously have an interest. So you guys are ahead of the curve already as far as what can be done and what next steps could be. But as far as URM policy, I do think that there have been some great resources already discussed today between the ASAP program, the work that Historic Seattle does, and just the advocacy of getting the word out on the street of what needs to be done and how and where. Two very good resources there.
We have found that there are a number of different situations for people that own unreinforced masonry buildings and the land underneath them, and that there are a lot of people who own the land and own the building and are not going to do anything no matter what you ask them to do or to consider. And it's a real issue because as buildings sort of decay or start falling down, as I was saying in one of my first slides, it then creates a magnet for activity that's dangerous and for vandalism and for people moving in that are unsheltered, and just a whole bunch of things. So it's a real issue in the historic neighborhoods, and I think that the best way to deal with it is to try to let as many people as possible know that this is creating a problem in the community, and then it can be pressure can be applied that way, possibly by the city, but if people own the building, there isn't a lot you can do about it if they feel really strongly about doing nothing.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that people may think they're avoiding the issue of a public hazard by having a building be vacant, but passersby could be harmed. People who take shelter in the building are still in danger, even if people aren't aware that they're in there. That's still a hazard. And buildings that aren't maintained are more likely to have extra damage occur from moisture or from fire or various other hazards. It's not just earthquakes. They become more vulnerable to everything. We have a couple more audience questions that I want to move on to. The first one, other building types are seismically at risk, for example, tilt-ups, not just URMs. Is there a political strategy to integrate those for a more broad awareness, letting people know that URMs will not be the only ones to fail? So whoever wants to answer this one, jump in.
Well, I can start by saying the URMs really have kind of risen to the top in terms of level of danger and level of severity and level of problem, because a lot of the schools are in URMs. I mean, it's just a really, really important issue. And so I think that the focus has been on trying to be very, very clear about that category of buildings. And I think once there is movement on that, that would be a great time to then say, okay, well, this worked for URMs, and we've gotten through the kind of legislation necessary, and then we can move on to other things that are dangerous.
Yeah, my sense is they're not looking at the other ones until they deal with the URMs. And I mean, in the policy committee that I was in, there was just recognition that, as I mentioned earlier, that in California they've moved on. They're looking at other masonry buildings, but we're so not even there yet. We're not even close. So.
Yeah, the uses of the building and the risk of life safety in brick buildings, that's sort of like the highest density at the moment. So while other buildings are likely to fail in a similar way, or not in a similar way, but likely to fail in a seismic event, there's less of a risk of human life, we feel, than for URMs at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having this quantifiable risk makes it a good first step, but there's a lot more to be sure. Another question from the audience is, do you think that the CPACER legislation and developing King County program will help address URM retrofits? And I'm not the most informed on that, but CPACER generally is about providing funding mechanisms for sustainability, including seismic resilience in our built environment.
I know that the CPACER bills were things that were very, of a lot of interest to the Office of Emergency Management at the city. And so, they asked us, and our whole group sent letters and things in support of them. But it was a step. It was a far enough step removed for us that was as far as it went. So I can't answer the question about whether I think it will make a meaningful difference or not for the work that we're trying to do.
Okay, any other input on that, or do we want to move on? Okay, so we had an audience member point out, besides financial and technical assistance, the mandate should advise owners on available tax credits, transfer of air rights outside of same city block but in the same neighborhood, inform the community on available entities and or interested constituents' similar needs. So basically, if I'm a building owner and I have this mandate, how do I know where to go for all of this information about what I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to make it happen? So I think this brings us two questions. One, can we push the city to have some sort of resource that is like a roadmap for building owners? Or two, knowing that right now no such thing exists because no mandate exists yet, what can a building owner do as a first step in trying to figure out how to address this problem in their building? And I think let's start with Kate as the architect, and then let's move to Eugenia and Lisa.
Sure. I'm going to give you the architect's opinion and then the Seattle human opinion. So, I mean, the first is that there are architects, there are engineers in the city that do seismic retrofits often. And we do understand, okay, this is the information that was available to past people. This is the information that's available to, where you can go to see XYZ, depending on the type of client it is. I mean, there are different opportunities for not-for-profits, as Eugenia's mentioned, as there are for for-profit developers. But there are opportunities. Different folks different organizations are focusing on things, and you can take it from a preservation point of view. The National Park Service could give you historic tax credits to preserve a building, and seismic retrofits are part of that because it preserves the building. Or you can, go down other routes like that. So you do have professional resources in the community that are great, even if the city's a little slow in picking up the clear and concise and easily accessible roadmap to get to where you need to go. The Seattleite in me, though, also says we are a city that is built on tech. And we've seen over the past year, to use that as an example again, the ability for individuals who are passionate about this to get information out to the community in a clear way. So anything from finding a COVID vaccination to understanding charts and graphs about how things have been going, in our current world situation. The resources, the skill sets to make things widely available and findable on the internet are literally in our backyard. It's a matter of how do we get the right resources so it's not just in the brain trust of individuals scattered across the city.
Yeah, I think that was a really good question. I think, well, so the policy committee, we've talked about, so there was the idea of an ombudsperson, whether that person would reside within the city or they would contract out that position, so that there would be a point of contact for anyone to go to ask all these questions. And then this person would then direct them to whether it's technical assistance or if you have questions about permitting, or how do I go find a structural engineer or an architect, and all that. And then to the questions about financial incentives. And so, and transfer development rights and all those things. And so this person was supposed to be a friendly face for the mandate, basically. And so you can sort of help someone navigate something that is not easy. So we all thought that was a really good idea. And I think hopefully whatever does happen in the future, that this is part of that, and then that the city does create that and has funding for it, whether they do it in-house or contract with an organization to do that.
We spent in the work that our group was doing with the city, we spent a lot of time talking about setting up a structure, a public-private partnership that would have somebody leading it, who would essentially be doing the things that Kate and Eugenia are talking about, but also who would be administering the retrofit credit program, so that essentially what would happen is that the developer would pay X amount to buy credits. The building owners would get X number of credits depending upon the square feet of the buildings that they had. And the money would go into this organization and then be going out with very specific oversight that it was going to then be used for retrofits, along with referrals to service providers that could be doing the retrofits, et cetera. But one of the things we talked about was that a reason for doing that is that you really need to have a very robust marketing and sales element to retrofit credit programs in order to have them be successful. And so, there were going to be multiple functions that this public-private partnership would be pursuing to make sure that, in fact, the amount of money was generated from this that was envisioned, and also that it was used properly for the retrofits as it was intended to be.
I think you all made really good points. Eugenia is about having a liaison with the city who acts as a guide. That would be incredibly useful. What Kate and Lisa were saying about technology and marketing. If you think about in COVID, it's like, where do I find a vaccine? That kind of effort could be applied to this type of situation as well. And just a personal plug on my online exhibit, whenseattleshakes.com. There's an actions and opportunities page that includes a list of resources for the public. And some of those are historic preservation funding opportunities. There's a link to CPACER. And that is just a starting point. I would love to see a more exhaustive guide developed by the city, along with a ton of funding to throw at all of you who want to do retrofits. But for now, that is a starting point. And someone just put in the chat, they used to have a city resource for residential retrofits. We used them back in 2001 to do a seismic retrofit. I haven't seen that, but if you want to drop a link to that in the chat, if it still exists, that would be amazing. And finally, we have one more question in the chat, which is, do you foresee a mandate requiring upgrades and retrofits in the URM buildings? I think we've been saying that it definitely needs to happen. And then they ask, has this been successful in California? And Lisa's nodding, so I'll let Lisa start.
Yeah, I mean, we were looking at different towns, cities in California as examples of that would be, that were way ahead of us, which I think Eugenia flagged earlier. So California is way ahead, and it has been successful there, and they have been mandates that were passed. So, what we're finding is that without the mandate, it doesn't happen. But the key is that the mandate has to come with financial assistance. And so that's the winning combo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think right now, California is doing that same process, but for their soft story buildings, or specifically San Francisco is. I don't know about the rest of California. As we mentioned earlier in the discussion, there are other buildings at risk that are not URMs that are sort of requiring the same process. In the chat, someone just put a link to SDCI, the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. They have a page on issuing permits for earthquake home retrofits. So if that's useful to anyone, and it almost certainly is, I would encourage you to check it out. And we have one more question. And if we can just get through that in the next 4 minutes, we'll be wrapping up. So this person says that they're working for a general contractor who's seen through about a dozen retrofits. How best do you see owners of URMs finding our services? So yeah, if you're a contractor who specializes in seismic retrofits and you want owners to know that this is something that you can do, how do you get the word out? And I think for these people, they might also be asking, how do they get into like a list of resources by the city or some other thing? Like there are people who specialize in this, so how do we connect those pieces?
So I don't know if it's probably the same, but I do know, so the city's landmarks, their preservation program, when people contact them for, oh, I need to do window restoration, or I need to do masonry, I need a tuck point at my building. I think the city staff cannot technically or legally refer someone to a private contractor or firm. So oftentimes they send them to us and then we talk to them about what the issue is, and then we'll think of someone, and then we'll either refer someone or send them to our preservation directory. The Washington Trust for Historic Preservation's website, they also have a directory of consultants and contractors and firms that kind of have different specializations. So so I don't believe the city can keep a list of contractors. Yeah.
Yeah, the conflict of interest. So I think the answer is talk to Historic Seattle. Lisa and Kate, do you have anything else to add on connecting experts to building owners?
Yeah, I mean, we knew that that was going to be a huge need. And so again, this public-private partnership idea was involved because, you know, they then could have a list of approved contractors, and they would have a methodology for approving them. And so that would be a way that it would be made easy to have the financing and the contractors, you know, et cetera, all in the same place, and with somebody who really knowledgeable running it. But you know, because it's not part of the city, you'd be able to be helpful in that way.
Okay, we are at the end of our time. So thank you everyone for your questions and your participation, and thank you to our panelists for all of your thought and experience that you're bringing to us in your responses.
Thank you. Yeah, Mary, for such a good job, and for you panelists. Imagine a big round of applause from our audience right now, okay? Because you all did fantastic. And I want to thank our audience for attending and for sharing your really thoughtful questions. And then, you know, once again, there's so much more information that you can learn from at the website of When Seattle Shakes. And I also wanted to share with you, Washington State is premiering its early earthquake warning system on May 4th. And you can learn more about this on the Shake Alert website. And so we've just put a link to that in the chat. So feel free to check it out. And if you're interested in more future events with SAF, I encourage you to check out our website and join us next week to learn more about what makes downtown Seattle so unique and so seismically unstable, as we learn about the protean shorelines with local geologist naturalist David B. Williams. And we'll explore the last vestiges of the former downtown bluffs, trace the island where Seattle was founded, and examine how subterranean fill still affects the modern landscape. It's actually a really, really fantastic presentation. So I hope you'll join us for that. There is a link for that in the chat as well. And with that, that is all I have to say. Once again, a very big thank you to all of our participants. I've learned so much. I knew so little before we started. So this has been an amazing journey for me personally. And I appreciate everyone spending their evening with us at the Seattle Architecture Foundation.
Thank you.
With that, I wish you all a very good night.
Thanks. Bye.